Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. This is the ninth part of What If Deku Can't Stop Adopting Kids. Hope you enjoy. Link to the original story and author in the description. Chapter 46, and then there were 10, x2. What do you mean 2 kids are coming tomorrow? It's too early. Izuku all but shouted into the phone. What do you mean? What do I mean? Nami asked sarcastically on the other end. You just released a stream talking about how terrible Diose to the children they keep. People are up in arms. So we're moving a bit faster to get the kids to you. Izuku remembered Kiba's stream, and how his actions and what was said on that stream could lead to Diose freaking out a bit and doing something like this. The green-haired dad sighed, as he realized he kinda dug his own grave here. Well, I guess when you look at it that way it makes sense. Still, I wish you'd given me more of a heads up. You don't really need to prepare much. These kids don't require any special needs, outside of the ones they already have, that is. Nami yawned. Well anyway, it's late so I'm gonna head to bed. It's 1 p.m. Izuku pointed out. And that's really late if you plan to stay up all night drinking, Nami explained. Anyway, you should get the files for those 2 in a few hours or so. Bye. Nami hung up, and Izuku felt a migraine washing over him. He wanted to take some medication for it, but according to the medical website he consulted, taking too much medication could have adverse effects on his health. Ugh. I feel so tired. I don't think I could even read the files like this. Izuku had no choice but to admit defeat and fall to his body's limitations this time around. My tablet will notify me of any new messages anyway. Reluctantly, Izuku made his way over from his desk, into his room, and finally onto his bed. He laid his tablet on the night table next to him and looked over at the seer grim that he had in his room. Wake me up when this goes off. The seer made a strange gurgly bony noise, to notify that it heard its instructions. With that done, Izuku closed his eyes and immediately passed out. A few hours later. After a few-hour nap, that Izuku won't admit he desperately needed, he had received the files on the 2 new children and was currently finishing up on reading them. The children were siblings. A brother and sister. Junkan and Nara. Both 10 years old. Junkan was of average height, brown hair, and green eyes, with a pretty average build. Nara was just a bit taller than her brother, with the same green eyes. She was a redhead, and her hair was short, not even going down to her shoulders. They had the same quirk, and that quirk was very interesting. Their quirks were called Omni and allowed each child to transform into 10 different forms. All of which had been given names, seemingly by the children themselves. Starting with Junkan. The first form that was documented was apparently called Upgrade. And the photo showed it to be some sort of black, white, and yellow creature. It seemed to be like Sanson in that it wasn't really a solid creature, rather it was more like a sentient liquid. Its ability allowed it to merge itself with technology, which would not only give it control over said piece of technology, but also allow it to alter, or upgrade, that piece of technology. His second form, 4 arms, was aptly named, as it did indeed have 4 arms. It essentially just looked like a big red guy with 2 sets of arms and eyes. This one's power seemed to be super strength, as well as reaping the benefits of having 4 arms. Wild Mutt was a massive, orange dog-like creature, about twice the size of a wolf. Noticeably it lacked any sort of eyes. Its ability, alongside its natural strength, agility, and claws, seemed to be some sort of smell-based sonar. Despite not having eyes, it can get a perfect sense of its surroundings. If anything, they were better than eyes. Stinkfly was a giant bug-like creature that, on top of smelling absolutely disgusting apparently, could fly. It also could shoot a strange sticky goop out of its 4 eyes, tentacles? Lastly, it also had a rather sharp tail that could apparently rip through steel. Igai was a large green muscular humanoid creature, with eyes all over its body, with a huge one in its chest, and on its face where its eyes would be, were 2 massive ears. Apparently, those eyes all shot lasers. Each one is powerful enough to rip through a car. Heat Blast was another humanoid, but this one looked to be made entirely out of rocks and fire. It was like Netsu, in that it had the ability to control and manipulate fire. It also had the ability to absorb fire into itself. Feedback was yet another humanoid, with a slick black color scheme with a dash of white. It had only one eye though, as well as 2 long antennae and a tail. A notable thing about those antennae and the tail is that at the ends of them were wire-like tubes, with holes at the end. These same things were at the tips of all of its fingers. The purpose of these tied into its main ability: absorbing, storing, and redirecting energy. It could absorb pretty much any kind of energy through those tubes, store it in its body, and then shoot it back out. Blitzwolfer was what one would imagine a werewolf to look like, complete with the imposing size and deadly claws. On top of the previously mentioned claws, it also had enhanced physiology, and its jaw could open up into 4 separate parts, and unleash a sonic attack similar to Present Mike. Second to last was Ripjaws, a giant fish-like creature with a massive, sharp jaw, and a thing on his head that reminded him of an anglerfish. It had 2 forms. One with legs that had webbed feet much like its webbed claws. And the other gave it a big tail, similar to a merman. This one was obviously aquatic and thus had the ability to breathe underwater. It could swim at incredible speeds, and its claws were extremely sharp. Although its jaw was even more dangerous, capable of chomping down on pretty much anything. This form, however, had a massive weakness, in that it needed water pretty much constantly, and could only survive without for about 4 minutes. Lastly, for Junken, there was Ghost Freak. And as the name implied, it was very pale and ghost-like, being a roundish white figure with a tail instead of legs, a bunch of black trails running along its body, that its singular eye could move along. Much like a ghost, it could turn intangible, as well as being able to possess people by going inside them. Moving on to Nara, her first form was called Grey Matter, and it was extremely small, only reaching just above Izuku's ankle. It was mostly humanoid except for its head, which was mostly taken up by its huge eyes that had rectangular pupils. Its main ability was enhanced intelligence. In this form, Nara was smart enough to construct complex machines out of junk. The next one was big, both in its height and in its width. It was called Cannonbolt. It had a mostly white body with some black stripes and pink armored parts all around its body. According to the files, it could roll up into an armored ball and spin at rapid speeds, hitting into things and bouncing off walls like a living cannonball. Hence the name. Next was a humanoid lizard hybrid. It was very thin, with 3 sharp claws, and a pointy helmet-like head, and a long tail. The most notable feature was its feet, which seemed to have little ball wheels attached to them. This one, called XLR-8, could move at astounding speeds, capable of running on water, outspeeding cars, and even some trains. Moving on was another lizard-like creature, but this one was a quadruped. With a blue head and black and white body, it would be hard to tell what this creature's power was if the name Articuana didn't give it away. It could shoot blasts of extremely cool pressurized air that would freeze pretty much anything it touched. Back onto humanoids with the next one, Diamond Head. This was a large woman that seemed to be entirely made out of crystals. Despite the name, they weren't diamonds, but rather an extremely strong unique crystal that looked similar to diamond. On top of being incredibly durable, Diamond Head could manipulate their body, not like Sanson or Upgrade could, but rather they could shift it around a bit. As well as being able to shoot pieces of it off as projectiles, which implied that it also had some sort of regenerative abilities as well. Lastly, it could also cause crystals to grow and erupt nearby itself. On to another smaller one. Ditto was the only one of these forms that didn't change Nara's height all that much. It was humanoid with cartoonishly large hands, and some fins on its head. Its main ability was cloning, able to make up to 30 copies of itself. Although all the clones experienced the same sensations, so if one clone got hurt all the others would feel it. It's unknown what would happen if one of the clones died. From small to big, came the biggest transformation here. Humongacer. A giant humanoid dinosaur creature that stood around 20 feet tall. It could also grow to about 30 feet in a similar way to a lady, although doing so would strain its heart as it tried to pump blood through the entire body, and thus would cause the creature to faint if they remained in that state for too long. Their size gave the user incredible strength, however, they would be rather slow. The next one, blocks, was a gorilla made up of multicolored Lego blocks? Well, there were stranger quirks. Regardless, the creature had the ability to manipulate and shift its body, as well as break it apart, like a Lego set. Its blocks seemed to be about as tough as steel, so they were very durable. And it also seemed to be able to regrow its lost body parts at an accelerated rate. Wildvine was next, and it appeared to be a giant moving Venus flytrap with tentacle-like roots for legs, and a head with a single eye coming out of the mouth of the trap. This one had the ability to control plants in its nearby surroundings, as well as being able to, much like blocks, stretch and manipulate its body at will and could regenerate. It also had black egg-like seeds growing from its back, which according to the notes, exploded like grenades after 5 seconds of them being removed from their back. The last form was called Lodestar. Another humanoid one, it being mostly black with some blue thrown in. Its hands, feet, and shoulders all were shaped like strange tuning forks, with the head floating in between its 2 large shoulders via some sort of magnetic power. Speaking of magnetic power, that seemed to be its ability. Lodestar could control and bend metal to its will, using its hands? Its body was also made up of hundreds of thousands of smaller magnets, allowing it to put itself back together if it gets harmed, although its head is completely solid, and can't regenerate in any way. With this many forms and this many abilities, it would seem like these kids would be the most powerful and versatile of them of all. If it weren't for a few major weaknesses. The first and most important was that both children could only stay in their forms for about 10 minutes, afterward, they would turn back to normal, and wouldn't be able to use their quirk again for another 10 minutes. It's speculated that with further training, exercising their quirk, and just aging, this time limit could be expanded. Another weakness is that seemingly, once they transformed into something, they could not shift into another form. Or at least they couldn't do so currently. Perhaps with more training, this could be achievable. Lastly, was the issue of them not having full control of what they transformed into. Sometimes they panic and shift into a random form, which could cause problems. However, none of this would be all that terrible. So far, while they were powerful, they didn't seem overly dangerous. It made Izuku wonder why exactly their parents gave them up. Until he got to the last detail. And one of the most important ones. In their various forms, their personalities could shift slightly. Nara as XLR8 would become more impatient and twitchy. When Junken was Wild Mutt, he would act more dog-like. They were still themselves, and for the most part, this wasn't an issue. Except with one particular transformation. Ghost Freak. For context, these children were born to rather neglectful parents, who occasionally shouted verbal abuse at them. This caused resentment to build up in the 2 children, which was reasonable. This resentment is typically buried in fear of punishment from their parents. Of course, the kids could very easily physically overpower their parents, however, the duo did have a solid moral compass at least, and thus wouldn't try such things. That was until Ghost Freak came into the equation. The personality change that came with Ghost Freak was that it caused Junken to be more spiteful, angrier, and more wrathful, as well as being far more disposed to violence. This eventually caused Junken to straight up attack his own parents, which is what led to him being taken by Diyoshi, with Nara insisting that she leave with him. Ghost Freak, however, would continue to be a problem, attacking people out of spite and anger. And seeing as it could go through walls, containing him was a big issue. Junken of course hated this and absolutely didn't want to transform into Ghost Freak, however, due to their difficulties with controlling transformation, he sometimes didn't have a choice. So Diyoshi came up with a solution that would fix the accidental transformation issue. The Omnitrix. Named after the two's quirk, Omni, and Trick, because it was a trick. It was a watch-like support item that was attached to the user's wrist. The user would press down on a button, and a dial would pop up, showing a silhouette of one of their forms. They would rotate the dial to cycle through the silhouettes until they reached the form they wanted to be in, and then all they would have to do is press down on the dial, and then they would be in that form. They wouldn't be able to use their quirk without using the Omnitrix, and Ghost Freak's silhouette wasn't available on Junkin's watch, so he could no longer access that form. Except that was a lie. The only thing the Omnitrix actually did was the button thing and the silhouette thing. It didn't actually control Junken and Nara's quirks at all. That was scientifically impossible. Essentially, it was just a toy with almost no practical use except for a built-in timer that would cause the device to glow red if they were running out of time, or if their quirk was recharging. But Nara and Junken didn't know that. They were under the assumption that the Omnitrix could control and regulate their quirk. And because they believed this, they no longer suffered these accidental transformations. It was just one big placebo. It wasn't perfect, however. As the device itself essentially did nothing, and the control was reliant on the two's mental state. If they were extremely stressed or angry or something like that, then it would still be possible for them to have a transformation error. This was explained to the children as a glitch that would rarely occur. Izuku was, as he found himself more and more these days, of two minds about this. On the one hand, it was really the only way to prevent Junken from going on a rampage. And it would prevent a bunch of other mishaps as well. But on the other hand, this could be detrimental to their growth in the future. If they allow themselves to grow reliant on that device, then they would never learn how to control their quirks on their own. Izuku sighed. I guess I'll let them keep thinking that for now. Hopefully, Junken will be less resentful and have more control of himself in the future, and I'll be able to tell him then. Until then, he would let them keep believing the lies DOC told them. Alright, preparing their rooms should be easy enough. I'll put them right next to each other since they're siblings. Izuku spoke aloud. This should go smoothly, right? As if life wanted to immediately prove him wrong, he suddenly broke out into a coughing fit, and blood flew out of his mouth. He looked down at his blood-stained fist, and to his horror, he found it was even more blood than the last time. Alright. I'll take a break, for an hour. Izuku sighed. Then I'll book a doctor's appointment, in a month. That was a good time, right? The next day. Junken and Nara rode in the DOC limousine. In complete silence. Nara was shifting in her seat anxiously, looking around the window periodically. Her brother, on the other hand, was just casually messing with his Omnitrix. After looking out the window, Nara looked back at Junken with a worried expression. Why are you so calm? Why are you so stressed? Junken asked in return. It's just another government facility. It's just run by a different guy. It's not just another government facility. It's gonna be our home until we can live by ourselves. Nara pointed out sharply. And that guy is gonna be our legal guardian. He might actually, care about us. Junken scoffed. Yeah, right. We all know adults are all self-centered. What, so you're gonna be self-centered when you get older? Oh wait, you're already self-centered. Nara smirked for a moment before her serious expression returned. Even if that's true, there's gonna be other people our age. This could be our chance to make some real friends for once. PSH. Who needs friends? I have all the friends I need in here. Junken said, holding up his Omnitrix. Nara rolled her eyes. Well, you can be a friendless loser all you want. I am gonna actually try and socialize. That means talking to people, by the way. I know what that means. Junken lied. And I doubt you'll make any. Have you looked in a mirror? Before Nara could give a scathing retort, the car came to a stop. A few seconds later, Junken's door was opened by an agent. We're here. The two kids climbed out of the car and were immediately met with the sight of the enormous building that was the Midoriya household. Both children looked at it in awe, with eyes wide as dinner plates, as they looked up at the building. Whoa! Junken gasped. This place is huge. It is a lot to take in, isn't it? The two looked back down and saw Izuku walking towards them, with Kei by his side. Hello there. Izuku greeted them with a smile on his face. My name is Izuku Midoriya. I'll be your guardian from now on. And I'm Kei Midoriya. Nice to meet ya. Kei said, rushing over to the two of them and extending her hand out for a handshake. The two didn't return that handshake though, because they were too busy staring at Izuku in disbelief. Izuku sighed. Yeah, I'm probably younger than you expected. I get that a lot. I ask you to just ignore that. It'll make everything much easier. Okay, Nara said. This wasn't what I expected, at all. Hey! Don't forget about me. Kei started waving her hands in front of the two to get their attention, eventually getting them to focus on her. Oh, sorry. Nara looked at Kei's hair for a few seconds, before forcing herself to look away and focus on her face instead. My name's Nara. Nice to meet you. Junken did not have the same tact and openly stared at Kei's hair. Your hair is freaky. Smack. Ow. Junken cried out in pain and Nara smacked him on the back of the head. Don't be insensitive, you jerk. Nara quickly scolded her brother, before turning to Kei with a worried expression. I am so sorry about him. I'm sure you snakes are wonderful. Kei smiled at the compliment, and her snakes hissed pleasingly. Thanks. And don't worry. I've been called much worse. Nara flinched at that statement and looked at the girl apologetically. Oh, sorry? It's okay. Kei then turned to Junken. Hi. What's your name? Junken. But just call me Ken. The older boy insisted as he took a step back, Kei's overflowing energy being a bit much for him. Meanwhile, in the background, the DOC agents had finished taking the two kids' stuff out of the car. That's everything. We're leaving. Izuku nodded as the DOC agents got in their car and drove away. Well, we should take you and your things up to your room, Izuku said, as he took a whistle out of his pocket and blew on it. By the way, don't panic. The two children gave him a confused look, but before they could ask why he said that, two Biringels jumped off the roof and crashed into the ground, startling both children. Ah! They both shouted in fear, both jumping back and instinctively pressing the buttons on their Omnitrix, ready to transform and take on the beasts. Wait! Izuku shouted out, stopping both the kids who gave him confused and panicked looks. Don't worry. These are friendly. They don't look friendly. Nara exclaimed. They're like demons. Ken shouted. Yup. Those are the Grim. Kei explained. They're scary, but they won't hurt you. They help a lot around the house too. Watch this. Do a jump. At her command, the Biringels jumped 12 feet in the air before crashing back down into the ground with a loud thud. As Kei said, these are the Grim. They are essentially mindless puppets that act as servants. These ones are called Biringels. There are other types of Grim, but they all have a similar aesthetic. So you should be able to tell what's a Grim and what's not. Izuku explains further, before looking at the Grim. Grab their luggage, and follow us. The Grim nodded and did as they were instructed, grabbing the luggage in their massive hands, before turning to Izuku, waiting for him to go somewhere. Kei, why don't you go tell everyone else about the others? I'd like to introduce them to everything a bit more, calmly. Izuku asked her. Kei frowned for a moment, before nodding and running back into the house. Okay, you two follow me to your rooms. You're free to ask any questions you'd like on the way. Izuku says as he started walking into the house, with the two kids and the Grim in tow. When the kids got into the house, they immediately started looking around, admiring the sheer size of the facility. They managed to get all the way up the first flight of stairs, before starting to ask questions. So, can we control these things too? Ken asked Izuku in a hopeful tone. Nara rolled her eyes. Really, that's the first question you want to ask? What? You're telling me you don't want to control an army of demon monsters? Ken asked defensively. Izuku gave an amused chuckle. Control of the Grim is given to all the kids and staff. Although Yami is the only one capable of giving people that control. He's another one of the kids here and makes these with his quirk. So if you want control of them, you just have to go to him. Sweet. Ken pumped his fist. Nara facepalmed and shook her head at her brother's childishness, before looking up and around herself. She saw a few more Grim walking around. A few Beowulfs and a passing seer. But no humans. No children. Speaking of the kids and staff. Where are they? Nara asked. Most of the kids are either in their rooms or outside. There may be a few others scattered throughout the house. Izuku explained. As for the staff, well, I haven't really hired any yet. Wait, you mean you've been doing all this by yourself? Nara asked, a bit shocked that such a big place only had one human worker. Man, no wonder you look so tired, Ken noted. You must be doing a lot of work. You could say that, Izuku responded. Soon enough they reached two doors, with Nara and Ken's names on them. Set the bags down in front of the rooms, and then go back to your post. Izuku ordered the bearing Ls. The Grim did as ordered, before going away, leaving Izuku with the kids. These will be your rooms. You're free to decorate them as you please. If you want anything, there is a board in one of the hallways where you can write down what you want. I'll try to get it for you before the end of the week. Izuku explained. Awesome. Ken cheered. You know, you're actually pretty cool. Don't expect me to call you Dad though. That's fine, Izuku reassured him. A lot of people here think of me as a dad, but that's their choice. On paper I'm just your legal guardian, so you can consider me to be anything you want. Thank you for everything. Nara gave Izuku a polite bow. We really appreciate it. Izuku smiled at them kindly. You're welcome. If you need anything else, I'll be in my office on the top floor. Also, in your files, it said you wanted to be heroes? Yup. You're looking at the future, #1 hero. Ken said cockily. I think you'd have to have a brain to be #1 Nimrod. Nara scoffed. But yeah, we're gonna be heroes when we get older. Why bring it up? Well, there are actually quite a few other kids here that also want to be heroes. They spar against each other a lot, so feel free to join in. Izuku told them. Also, there is a training room where you can use your quirks at full power, without worrying about causing too much damage. Seriously. This place is awesome. Ken shouted, before running away. Training room, here I come. Hey wait doofus, you don't even know where you're going. Nara chased after her brother, leaving Izuku behind. I have a strong feeling that those two are gonna be a handful. Izuku sighed. Chapter 47, Shorts 11. Little Purple Book. Nara was in the training room, practicing her quirk. She had just finished using one of her transformations and was now waiting for her quirk to recharge. I need to improve more, Nara said, drinking a bottle of water to refresh herself. I can't let Ken beat me anymore. Given that both of them wanted to be heroes, Ken and Nara often sparred against each other. And more times than not, Ken won. Which was infuriating for multiple reasons, most of which was that it fueled his ego. She knew she was smarter than him. She had always gotten better grades in school, and she studied karate from a book, but she still studied it. And she never slacked on her training, so why did she still lose? Yo! Nara looked towards the door and saw Fu walking in, with a notebook in his hands. Oh. Hello. Nara greeted the younger boy. I'm Nara. I'm new around here. Fu, hi. But just call me Fu. Fu introduced himself before one of Kaiosei's tentacles came out. And this is Kaiosei. Yes, he lives inside me. Don't worry about it. Oh, okay? Nara was taken aback by the idea of someone living inside someone else, but she'd seen Ghost Freak do similar things, so it wasn't too strange. I heard about you and your brother's quirk from Dad. I find it very interesting. Fu complimented. Yeah, it's pretty cool, huh? Nara casually bragged, gladly taking in the praise. It is. All those forms that can do all sorts of different things. Fu took out his notebook. Like that lodestar form. Do you think you could use it to fly? You know, since its body is made out of magnets? No, I tried, and for some reason, that doesn't work. Nara frowned. She remembered being really disappointed when she tried that. Interesting, are magnets different from other metals? Maybe your metal controlling powers don't work on magnets? Fu speculated as he jotted down some notes. Nara paused. I never thought of that. I'll need to try that sometime. Who knows, maybe the magnetic force of Lodestar's body is so strong or dense or something it can't be manipulated. Interesting. Also, have you thought about maybe trying to get on top of a piece of metal and using that to fly? Fu asked her. Nara's eyes widened a bit. No. I should really try that. That sounds like it could work. I'd have to work on my balance, but it sounds plausible. She turned to Fu to thank him for his idea but found that he was furiously scribbling down notes, enraptured in his own little world. Fu? Nara waved a hand in front of him. Ha? Fu snapped out of his trance and looked back at Nara. Oh, sorry. We really like analyzing quirks and writing them down. It helps us come up with creative ways to use our quirks. It was at that moment that a light bulb went over Nara's head. That's it. Why don't we have a brainstorming session right now? All right. Fu shrugged. But let's do that in the library. A few minutes later, in the library. After walking from the training room to the library, Fu grabbed a blank, purple notebook for Nara to write stuff down in, and the two sat down at one of the tables. Alright, so have you used XLR8 to run on water yet? Fu asked. Yup. It's weird, and if I slow down or stop I fall into the water, but I can do it. Nara wasn't perfect at running on water, and she hadn't been able to practice it much until now, but she knew she was capable of it. Alright. Fu jotted that down. What about Diamond Head? Can you just make diamonds or can you control them? Like making them float around in the air and stuff? That's a good question. Another thing I'll have to try. Nara jotted that down as a reminder. And speaking of Diamond Head, I should try and see if I can use his diamonds to reflect sunlight into someone's eyes. Or you could use all the dust from running as XLR8 and get that in someone's eyes. Fu brought up. Or water, that also works. And I could use that water to put out fires. Nara imagined it, running on water so fast that the water followed behind her, and then she would turn and create a massive wave that would crash into a burning building or something, putting the fires out and saving the day. Suddenly Fu paused, as a thought occurred. Hey, why aren't you using gray matter? Nara gave him a confused look. What do you mean? I mean right now? Why aren't you using gray matter? Fu asked her. We're having a brainstorm, so why aren't you using the form which is only good for thinking? Nara's eyes went wide for a moment, and then immediately facepalmed. Oh my god, I forgot I had that. I don't really use gray matter for anything. I can't really use it in a fight too much, and schools obviously didn't let me use it. So I just kinda forgot about it. Alright, let's try it. She moved her hands down to her Omnitrix, and she pressed the button, and the dial popped up. She moved the circle around until she found gray matter's silhouette. After pushing the dial down, suddenly half the room was encompassed with pink light. When the light died down, Fu saw nothing. Nara had seemingly disappeared. Ah! Gah! Gah! Fu saw the slightest bit of gray matter's head coming up as Nara jumped, trying to reach the table. Deciding to help, Fu extended one of Kyosei's tentacles over to Nara and grabbed her, lifting her onto the table. Thanks, Nara said. Her voice was a bit weird and nasally while in this form. She picked up the pencil, which was now almost as big as her, and walked over to her notebook. Now let's continue. What's underneath? Yeah, take that. Ken shouted out, as he mashed on the controller. We're almost there. He's almost dead. Netsu yelled at the top of his lungs. The two boys were currently playing Sumo Smashers 2 on co-op and were on the third boss. Despite having a too cool for anyone attitude, his conviction to be a lone wolf fell apart when he realized that being alone sucked and some of the people here were pretty cool. Like Netsu. Someone whom he quickly befriended, due in part to his personality, and also because he reminded him of Heat Blast. Then the boss's health bar depleted, and celebration music played. Yeah. The two boys dropped their controllers and jumped onto the couch, throwing their hands up in celebration. However, in his jubilation, Natsu accidentally lost control of his quirk, and fire burst out of the bottom of his pants, and onto the couch. Ah! Ken quickly jumped off the couch, which was now partially on fire. Ah, not again. Netsu lamented. Don't worry. I got it. Ken quickly activated his Omnitrix and turned the dial until he found Heat Blast's silhouette. He pressed down and after a flash of green light, there stood Heat Blast. Time to cool this place down. Ken quipped as he extended his hands out. The fire suddenly moved towards him and was sucked into his hands, and then after a few moments, the fire was gone. Absorbed into Ken. Wow! That's so cool! Netsu exclaimed, admiring the Heat Blast transformation. You took in all the fire. Yeah, I know, I'm awesome. Ken quickly gloated before looking at the half-burned couch and realizing there was about to be trouble. But it didn't save the couch. Aw man, this thing is toast. That Izuku guy is gonna be pissed. Not really. Huh? Ken looked behind him and saw a seer orb floating behind him. What the heck? The seer Grim had detected a fire and reported it to Izuku, and so now it was here on Izuku's behalf. Don't worry, I'm just speaking through the orb. It's like a camera and a speaker. Izuku said through the seer. And don't worry too much about the couch. The reason you guys are here is because you have a hard time controlling your quirks, so I knew something like this would happen. I have a few replacement couches in storage. I'm replacing it now. At that moment a Biringel came into the living room, picked Netsu off the couch, and then picked the couch up over his shoulder, before carrying it off. And then another Biringel came in with a new couch, identical to the old one, and then set it down, before leaving. Wow, that was fast, Ken noted, before looking back at the seer. So are we not in trouble? Back with Ken's old family, if they destroyed something by accident with their quirks, not only would they get grounded for a month, but he and his sister would get brutal tongue lashings, in a way that could be considered verbal abuse. No. It was just an accident that happened because of Netsu's quirk. I can't blame him too much. Izuku admitted. And you actually helped. If you hadn't put out the fire, then the sprinklers would have gone off and some of the things in the room would have gotten damaged and I would have had to replace them. You saved me a lot of trouble. If anything, you deserve to be rewarded. How about some extra ice cream tonight? Really? Ken exclaimed in excitement. Awesome. Well, I'll leave you two alone now. I have some things I need to get back to. See you at dinner. Izuku said before the seer slowly left the room. You know, for someone who works with the government, that guy is pretty cool, Ken admitted. Yeah, Dad's great. He doesn't yell at us or punish us unless we hurt each other, or ourselves. Netsu explained. So you can absorb fire, right? Duh. You just saw me do it. Ken pointed out. So, if you absorbed enough of my fire, could we see what I look like? Netsu had never actually seen what he looked like under the fire. Sure, if he got doused with enough water, then he would eventually get put out, but that wouldn't last long enough for him to actually see himself. Ken's eyes widened a bit, as he realized that could be possible. He smirked and said. Let's go get a mirror. A few minutes later. After quickly borrowing a mirror from Kiba, they put it up into the training room, and Netsu stood in front of it. Alright. I'm ready. Netsu was bouncing with excitement. He had to do everything he could to keep from flying right now. Ken stood behind him and moved his hands towards Netsu. Netsu's fire started moving towards Ken, as he absorbed it into his body. After a few moments, the fire seemed to peel off of Netsu's body, slowly revealing the boy underneath, until it was gone, and they could finally see what he really looked like. Whoa! Netsu stared in the mirror at his true appearance. His eyes were amber, and his hair was scarlet red. His skin was very tan, and he had freckles, like Izuku. His entire form was glowing, and fire still poured off of him as Ken absorbed all the flames that tried to engulf him. Netsu only got to look at himself for about half a minute, before they heard a sound come from the Omnitrix. BRR. Ken looked down at the Omnitrix and saw it was blinking red. Oh. BRR 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 BRR. There was a flash of red, and then Ken was back into his normal form. Ah, man. Immediately Netsu's body burst into flames, and he was also back to normal. But unlike Ken, he wasn't too upset about it. In fact, he turned to the other boy with a huge smile. That was awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much. Ah, it's not a big deal. Sorry, you couldn't see it for much longer. Stupid time limit. Ken lamented, scowling at his Omnitrix. It's okay. It was cool. But I still think being on fire all the time is more awesome. Netsu admitted. On one hand, being on fire all the time could be a huge nuisance, and dangerous in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, his fireproof gear mitigated a lot of those issues, and it just looked so cool. Seeing himself without fire was a novelty, but overall he preferred his usual look. Hey, let's see whose fire is stronger later. Netsu challenged. Ken smirked. You're on. Twice the strength versus twice the arms. Ken was just sitting in his room, casually watching some TV in a beanbag chair, while dumping popcorn down his throat. Bam 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 bam. He almost jumped from how loud the knocking on his door was. Gah! Who knocks that loud? Now a bit annoyed, he paused the TV and turned to the door. Who is it? Taking that as common, the culprit behind the knocking opened the door, revealing herself to be Kiba. Greetings, newbie. I am Kiba. It is your honor to meet me. Kiba introduced herself arrogantly. Ken raised an eyebrow. My honor? I think you got that the other way around. It's your honor to meet me. You're looking at the future #1 hero after all. And that is why I am here, Kiba explained. You see, there are many living under this household who believe that they are the future #1 hero. But we all know there can only be one #1. And that of course will be me. But, to prove this, I must crush any of those who would question my power. And now it's your turn to be crushed. Oh really? Ken stood up and looked down cockily at the smaller child. Well, then I guess we have to settle this. 1-on-1. My thoughts exactly. Kiba said, returning the cocky smirk. But we must settle this tonight. I have preparations I must make. I will be live streaming our battle for my hundreds of thousands of minions to enjoy. Before she had his interest. Now, she had his attention. Wait, so I get to have hundreds of thousands of people see how awesome I am while I kick your butt? Ken smiled as he imagined a large crowd of people cheering him on. Heck yeah! If you mean that hundreds of thousands of people get to see your shameful defeat, then yes, that is what will be happening. Kiba told him. Until then, I bid you goodbye. And without another word, Kiba left. Ken smirked. I'll show that girl who's boss. Little did he know he would regret that mindset come tomorrow. Later that night, Ken and Kiba were outside in a clearing in the forest. staring down each other while about 10 feet away. Nara was on the side, having volunteered to be the camera girl, partially because she was hoping to see her brother get his butt handed to him. Fu was also present, managing the live stream on a laptop. "We're on," Fu shouted. Nara held up the camera, and the audience saw Kiba and Ken square off. "Hello, my minions. Recently we have received new arrivals at the house. One of which is the one you see in front of Ken," Kiba introduced. "Hey," Ken said, crossing his arms trying to look cool. "And the other one is the one holding the camera. Her name is Nara," Kiba explained. "Hi." Nara waved her hand in front of the camera. "Today I will be having a battle with Ken, to prove who is superior," Kiba announced. "Now without any further delay, Ken. I will give you 10 seconds to transform before I start attacking. Choose whichever form you'd like. And choose wisely." "Ha! Well then." Ken smirked as he pressed the button on his Omnitrix. "Let me show you what 4 arms can do." After a flash of green light, Ken's form was replaced by 4 arms. "Guess we're starting." Nara pressed the button on her own Omnitrix, and selected an transformation, and after a flash of pink light, she was XLR8. "You ready for a beating, little girl?" Ken asked cockily, as he cracked all of his knuckles. "I'll let you get the first shot." Kiba smirked, and dramatically threw her cloak off of her body. "Thank you. What a gentleman." Suddenly, Kiba dashed towards him at horrifying speeds. All 4 of Ken's eyes widened as he could barely see Kiba coming at him, but he couldn't react before Kiba jumped up and drop-kicked him right in the chest. "Gah!" Ken shouted out in pain, as his body flew back dozens of feet through many trees. His body tumbled through the dirt until he managed to grab the ground with all 4 of his hands and dig his fingers into it, slowing himself until eventually, he stopped. "Okay, she's fast, and she's strong." Ken pulled himself up and rubbed his chest. "This might be a bit harder than I thought." A second later, Kiba jumped out of trees and went to dive kick Ken. Ken just barely managed to react to this and grabbed Kiba out of the air by her foot and slammed her into the ground. Now with the overconfidence being literally kicked out of him, Ken didn't relent and started pounding Kiba into the ground with all 4 of his arms, and all of his strength. The earth shook slightly with each blow, and Kiba sunk further and further into the ground. After a few seconds, she grabbed 2 of his arms, and tugged him closer to her, before kicking his chest, causing him to go flying off of her. "Aha! Alf!" Ken flew through the air for half a minute, before coming crashing down into the ground, a few feet away from Kiba. Both kids took a few moments to recover, before rising to their feet and staring each other down. Knowing she was faster than him, Ken decided to rush forward first, charging at her with his arms outstretched to grab her. Kiba did the same, and the 2 clashed, locking hands. Although, Ken's hands were way bigger than Kiba's. Fortunately, while Kiba's hands were busy, Ken had another pair, and his lower arms punched Kiba in the face 2 times. Kiba growled and grit her teeth. She pushed back against Ken, immediately overpowering him and causing him to move back, keeping his lower arms out of range of her, while still having their arms locked. "No way, way. She's stronger than 4 arms." Ken's eyes widened in horror, as he realized just how badly he underestimated his opponent. Kiba broke free of Ken's grip, and charged at his legs, kicking them out from under him and causing him to fall to the ground. Then before he could get back up, she grabbed his legs and started spinning him around. "Whoa! Whoa! Whoa! Whoa!" Ken put his hands over his mouth to keep himself from throwing up, as he spun even faster and faster, the world around him becoming a blur. "I'm gonna hurl." "What?" "Ew." Not wanting him to throw up anywhere near her, Kiba threw him high into the air, far away from her. "Ah!" Ken screamed as he went flying through the air for almost a full minute before he started falling. Fear built up inside of him as he saw the ground get closer and closer. He put his arms over his face to protect himself and then... crash! He hit the ground, hard. so hard it kicked up an eruption of dirt and dust. When the dust cleared, Ken was left lying there in a crater, his body splayed out and in pain. Ow! Ken groaned as he continued to lay there and let the pain wash over him. A few seconds later, Nara came speeding in, still pointing the camera at him. "You are getting thrown around like a ragdoll." Nara snickered. "You ready to give up yet, dork?" "Ack. Not on your life." Ken started to raise himself up and onto his feet. "Well, then you better be ready. Because she was right behind me," Nara warned him. Just at that moment Kiba came rushing out of the bushes and lunged at him. Ken moved to the side just in time to miss Kiba, whizzing past him like a bullet. "I can't let her get close to me, or I'm toast," Ken thought, looking around to see if there was anything he could use to his advantage. He saw a rocky cliffside about 10 feet away from him, and immediately knew he had to head towards it. Of course, there was the issue of how he was gonna make it there without Kiba making it to him first. A question he would have to answer soon, as Kiba was once again lunging towards him. With not much time to think, he swung back his arms, before bringing them back forward with a thunderous clap that sent a shockwave forward, right at Kiba. The shockwave hit Kiba dead on, causing her to go flying back. Not letting this moment go to waste, Ken booked it towards the rocky cliffside, making his way over to it in a couple of seconds. Meanwhile, Kiba had gotten back up, and was about to make her way back to Ken, when suddenly she got pelted in the face with a rock. Gah! Ken was now ripping rocks out of the cliffside, and throwing them at Kiba, rapid fire. Gah! Ah! Bah! Kiba put her hands out in front of her as she was hit with rock after rock, every other second. After a few more moments of this assault, eventually, Kiba just said screw it and charged through the onslaught of rocks, tanking the blows to get closer to Ken. Quickly realizing that the rocks wouldn't buy him any time, Ken jumped up a few feet, causing Kiba to dash straight into the cliff, hitting herself against the rocks and causing a massive impact crater. Ken dug his fingers into the rocky cliff, making an indent so he could stay on the wall and away from Kiba. Kiba looked up at him with a scowl. "For a so-called future #1 hero, you seem to be fond of running away rather than fighting me. It's called tactics. Look it up," Ken quipped before he went back on the offensive. He dug his two upper arms into the cliffside to keep him up there, while his lower arms started ripping chunks of the cliff out, and threw them at Kiba. "This again!" Kiba shouted in rage as she started zipping around the area to avoid the rocks. However, after losing her patience, she soon developed a new plan. She simply just jumped at him. Gah! Gah! Ken shouted as Kiba hit his back, forcing his face into the wall. The vampire girl clung to his back, kicking away Ken's lower arms as he tried to grab her feet. She then grabbed his head and started smashing it into the cliff, over and over and over again. Then, she moved over to his neck and bit into it with her fangs, and started sucking the blood out of his body. Ah! Why, you little! Ken flipped around, facing his back to the cliff, and smashing Kiba into it, but she held on and kept sucking his blood. Ken grabbed Kiba's head with one of his arms and tried to pull her off of him, but Kiba's strength was too immense, and he wasn't making much progress in getting her off. He quickly gave that up and started smashing his back, and by proxy, Kiba into the wall repeatedly. But even then, he wasn't getting anywhere. Out of options, Ken had one last idea. He flipped around again, facing his back away from the cliff, and then leapt off it, falling towards the ground with Kiba going with him. With not much time before she hit the ground, Kiba took her fangs out of Ken and kicked him off of her. Her intention was to then flip around and land on her feet in a classic superhero landing. Of course, that would require a lot of practice and experience, which she did not have, so what actually happened was that she flipped around, positioned her feet towards the ground, and then tipped over and fell on her face. Ack! Kiba groaned as she pulled her face out of the ground. Curses! Thump! Ken fell a few feet away from her, attempting to do the same thing, with the same results. His face planted firmly into the dirt. Nara giggled in the background. The two pulled themselves up and entered another stare down. You're clever, shapeshifter, I'll give you that. Kiba complimented as she panted and breathed heavily. Her dress was dirty and tattered, and she had more than a few cuts and bruises on her face. Yeah, and you're a lot stronger than I thought, Ken admitted. His clothes were also torn and his body was just as battered and bruised as Kiba's. But just cause you're a little stronger and faster doesn't mean you've beat me. Kiba smirked. Ha! It's funny that you still think you can win. Even though you've already lost. You see, as clever as you thought you were, you've made the biggest blunder you could have made, by forgetting about your biggest weakness. What do you dash? Before Ken could finish the question, he was interrupted by a familiar sound. BRR. Ken's eyes widened and he looked down at Omnitrix, which was now flashing red. No. BRR. Your time. Kiba started her sentence. BRR is up, Kiba said, finishing it. BRRRRRR. In a flash of red light, Ken was returned to his normal form. Ah, man. Before he tried to do anything else, Kiba dashed at him at speeds he could no longer react to and swept his legs out from under him, causing him to fall on his back, and then put her foot on his chest. The vampire girl, high of victory, looked down at her defeated opponent and gave the biggest shit-eating grin he had ever seen. Victory is mine. Chapter 48, Shorts 12. Sore loser. Nara sighed, as she stood in front of her brother's room. Ever since his loss to Kiba, he had been held up there and was in a terrible mood, to say the least. And so now here she was. All right. Time to be a good sister. She told herself, as she knocked on the door. Go away! Ken shouted out. Rolling her eyes, Nara decided to ignore this and enter the room anyway. Ken was laying on his bed, still pouting over his loss. He didn't even turn towards the door when he saw it open. I said go away. Well, I didn't listen, Nara responded. Hearing his sister's voice, he turned to look at her and scowled. Oh, it's you. What did you come to laugh at me some more? No, I've done enough of that to last me a few days, Nara admitted, leaning against the wall and preparing to have a long, frustrating conversation. Great. One less person laughing at me. Now if all the hundreds of thousands of people who watched that stream could stop laughing, that'd be great. Ken said bitterly. If it makes you feel better, looking at the comments at that video, people are actually pretty impressed with you, Nara admitted. They're impressed that I got knocked around the forest like a ragdoll? Ken asked sarcastically. They're impressed you lasted so long against Kiba. She's not exactly someone many people can fight. Let alone as long as you did. Nara explained. She's an OPC for a reason. Yeah, well, so am I. Ken pointed out indignantly. I shouldn't have lost so easily. You lost as 4 arms, so easily. Nara and Ken turned around and saw Izuku entering the room. Ah, Mr. Midoriya. What are you doing here? Nara asked him politely. Well, I came to see if Ken was alright, Izuku explained, closing the door behind him. I'm fine, Ken said curtly, crossing his arms trying to seem tough. I doubt that. Izuku sighed. As I was saying, you only lost to her as 4 arms. You didn't lose to her as a whole. What's that supposed to mean? Ken raised an eyebrow with curiosity. It means you still have 8 other forms, doofus. Nara pointed out. Right. Izuku nodded. 4 arms was probably the worst form you could have used to fight Kiba. 4 arms power is strength, and you were trying to fight someone stronger than you. Remember what happens when you use 4 arms to fight Humongousaur? Nara told him. Ken cringed, as he recalled why he didn't do that anymore. He got literally stomped. Kiba in general is kind of a bad matchup for you. Her main weakness is that she gets weaker the more she uses her strength, but with your time limit it's unlikely you'd be able to get her to a point where you could beat her just by stalling her out. Izuku summarized. Your best course of action would be to take out your opponent as soon as possible. while also making sure you don't get too reckless. Easier said than done, Nara muttered. She knew he was talking about Ken, but this applied to her as well. Izuku nodded in agreement. You're right. It's very hard to both go on the offensive while also remembering to keep your eyes peeled for any tricks and counterattacks. But that's the reason you train. To improve and work on things that you struggle with. The two kids thought about that for a moment, realizing how true that statement was. Alright, if forearms was a bad match, then who would have been better? Ken asked, thinking about that question himself. Well, I think I'll leave that on to you. Izuku would give him an answer, but the more this kid thought about his forms and how they would work well against his opponent's quirk, the better. Remember, your quirks aren't the most powerful here, but they are the most versatile here. Play your cards right, and you could potentially beat anyone here. And with that, he left, leaving the two kids to think about what he told them. While thinking about it, Stinkfly might have been a better choice, Nara told him. But you couldn't have done much damage from the air, meaning you'd have to come down eventually, and that girl could just throw boulders or jump at you, so not exactly a guaranteed victory. If I used Guy, I might have been able to blast her away and keep her from me. Ken speculated. Guess I won't know until I try. And with that, Ken got off his bed and made his way to his door. Where are you going? Nara asked him. Ken turned to her and smirked. I'm gonna challenge that girl to another fight. Let's see how she handles some lasers to the face. And just like that, he was gone. Nara shook her head, but a smile crept its way onto her face. Can't keep that idiot down. I am not sorry. Brrrrrrrr. In the forest, Ken was currently in his Guy form, practicing his aim on some trees. And given that he was mostly eyeballs, he was doing pretty well. Brrrrrr. Another tree branch was shot off, and Ken quickly celebrated. Ha! I rule. Ken gloated. Yeah, you do seem to have an eye for this, said a voice from the bushes. Ken turned around. Hey, who's eyeing me up? Then, Kay exited the bushes, with an all too pleased expression. Sorry. I didn't mean to peep in the cornea. I thought I heard some being excited and wanted to take a look. Kay said, opening up with a pun barrage. Ken squinted, as he immediately knew what was happening. He was being challenged. Challenge accepted. Well, I was just eyelashing these branches off with my lasers. I didn't blink anyone was gonna see me. Ken responded. I guess I was wrong. Guess everyone has their off gaze. Well, I think that you should take a break, Kay responded. Maybe have some ice cream. Nah, I am fine. But my throat's a bit dry, so I could use some water. Ken said. Iris, I had a cup of it now. Are you sure all you want is a wink? We have a nice PI waiting back home. And I think you should give it a glance. Kay said. Brow about you, go ahead and take sight for me, Ken responded. I'll stay here and shoot a few more trees. But I insisted. I have to ask, did you ever eat a pie before? Kay asked him. If you view what you were missing out on, you'd seen up really quickly so you could get some. As the two continued their eye-based pun assault, Mu watched on from behind the trees, trembling. Oh no. Now there's two of them, Mu whispered. I have to warn everyone, oh no, I'm doing it too. Ken and Kay would eventually stop and return to the house, but Mu quarantined himself for the rest of the day to make sure no one else caught the virus. What is okay? Nara was currently studying in the library, with a large stack of books next to her and a notebook by her side to take notes in. Izuku walked into the library and looked around, seeing that only Nara was present. So he decided to check on her. The girl was too engrossed in her own business to notice, and Izuku managed to pull up a chair and sit next to her without paying any attention to him. He watched her study so intently, it was admirable, but something was wrong. Nara, he said, getting her attention. Ah. Nara jumped in her seat and her head quickly swerved towards Izuku. Mr. Midoriya. Please don't do that. Sorry. I wanted to get a closer look at how you studied. Izuku apologized. What are you studying, by the way? Just some math stuff. Nara shrugged. You haven't enrolled us in any schools yet, and I doubt you have the time to homeschool us. Izuku sighed. School could be a bit of a problem once the ages of the kids he had under his care started to vary. He couldn't just give the same lesson to all the children anymore, as the younger ones may not understand it, and the older ones may already know it. So he had to find time to hold separate lessons for some of the kids, in his already tight schedule. Sorry about that. I've been looking at hiring a tutor, but well, my hiring process is a bit slow. Izuku said, simplifying his issues once again. I can see that. Nara was still stunned that this place had no other human employees. But, I want to have a successful future, so I have to work hard and study. Ah, I see. You are thinking seriously about your future. That's good. Just remember not to overwork yourself, and take breaks regularly. Overworking is bad for your health. Izuku told her, not giving a second thought to how much of a hypocrite he was. Yes sir, although, maybe you should take some of your own advice. Nara gave him a look over and it was easy to see just how incredibly tired he was. I'm fine. But Izuku brushed it off like usual. I have to work hard to keep this place operating, but enough about me, I have a question for you. Why aren't you using your forms to help you study? I imagine XLR8 or gray matter could make this process much faster. Nara gave him a confused look. Isn't that kinda cheating? Everyone back at my old school told me that if I ever tried to use my quirk to help me in school then I would get detention, or worse. Izuku sighed and shook his head. No Nara, it's not cheating. Schools have a tendency to be one way or another. Either they feverishly discourage quirk use or they encourage it past the point where they should. And neither is a good way of handling it. So you mean it should be somewhere in the middle? Nara asked, not sure exactly what Izuku was getting at. It's not really hard to figure out. Let people use their quirks to further themselves, but don't let them use their quirks to hurt or bully others. Izuku stated. It's that simple. But wouldn't that give some people an unfair advantage? Nara argued. While she would have appreciated it if some people were less harsh, she did understand that using gray matter on tests would be a bit unfair to all the other students. Izuku paused for a moment as he considered his next words. Nara. Let me tell you something. I learned when I was 5. Not all men are created equal. The moment Izuku finished that sentence, he got the expected reaction. Nara recoiled back, looking at him with both shock and a bit of confusion. I know, it's horrible, but it's true. Izuku sighed. Some people are born with quirks that put them ahead in life, whereas others, like myself, don't get to have a quirk at all. Nara's eyes got even wider at that revelation, and her mouth dropped. You're quirkless. Izuku nodded. I don't like talking about it much. But yes. I am quirkless. I'm kinda surprised you know about the quirkless. Most kids around your age have never even heard about them. I found out about them while I was doing a paper on the quirk wars, Nara explained, grimacing as she remembered what she read on how the quirkless were treated nowadays. Is it true that the quirkless are treated like Dash? That's not what we're talking about. Izuku cut her off. Although in doing so he inadvertently gave her his answer, causing her eyes to widen in horror. Back to what I was saying, not everyone is born equal. Some people are given advantages because of their quirks and some are given disadvantages. But as someone without a quirk, I don't think other people should have to hold themselves back just to make me look not as bad. Quirks aren't a device or something that can be naturally separated from someone. It's part of you, and asking you not to use them is like asking you not to use your own arm. Nara looked at the Omnitrix and considered what Izuku was saying deeply. schools, and society in general, have understandably hard time figuring out how to regulate quirks, Izuku explained, before getting up and gesturing to the room around them. But here is different. I own this house. And I own the land around this house. So what I say, goes. And I say that you are free to use your quirks as you please. In fact, I say you should. The more you get used to your quirk, the more control you'll have over it. Which means eventually you'll be able to reintegrate into society without the government worrying you'll set it on fire. My only request are that you don't hurt yourself, don't hurt anyone outside of sparring, and when you're sparring don't go too far and try to ease up on the property damage. Can you do that? Yes sir, Nara responded. Izuku slumped. Please, just call me Izuku. Suddenly, the door opened and a seer orb floated in and went up to Izuku. He looked into it and frowned. Well, it looks like your brother just destroyed one of the empty rooms. Ugh. Idiot. Nara facepalmed. Well, I have to go take care of that. Remember what I told you. Don't hold yourself back. Izuku told her, as he exited the room. Normally, this is where Nara returned to her studies, more determined than ever and willing to use her forms to get ahead. But right now she was a bit more concerned about Izuku. She held great respect for him and what he was doing and admired his work ethic. But at the same time, she questioned his decision to not hire more employees and was worried about the effect that was having on his health. Effects that he was passionately denying, despite them being clear as day. Not to mention she just found out he was quirkless and his unwillingness to talk about it implied very bad things about his past. All signs pointed to something going wrong, and Nara was left wondering if she would need to save someone long before she ever even got into UA. Chapter 49, Fu's Notes 2. Fukanoko Midoriya. Fukanoko, or just Fuku as she calls herself, is an 8-year-old girl with purple hair. She is the second most mysterious member of the family. The first being Mu, more on him later, and the third being Eri. She stays in her room pretty much constantly, only really coming out at night to sneak into the kitchen. I've only interacted with her in person once and it didn't go very well, so she avoids me. Even now that she's started coming out of her room more often, with a special hoodie on that covers her face, she still stays clear of me. Still looking for a way to make it up to her. But from what I've heard and seen, she's very, very easily frightened, and extremely paranoid, which is why doesn't leave her room. And she also puts herself down, a lot. Although I heard she's been getting better and becoming less scared. Her quirk is called fear gas. Fukanoko can emit a gas from her skin that causes almost whoever breathes it to hallucinate their worst fears. It's bad enough to drive people insane. Although it fades away fast, the dangerous part is that this gas explodes from her whenever she panics, which is a lot. Again, she's been working on it with Dad, but it's still very scary. Note, her quirk doesn't work on the undead, in other words. Me. Kai Midoriya. Kai is very interesting. He's 40 feet tall, with 3 massive heads. 2 wings, 2 legs, and no arms. His body is like a snake combined with a dragon, and is covered in massive green scales. Also is blood in poison. Don't know how strong it is, but Izuku just said it's very strong. Kai can talk, and see, and do everything we do with one head using all three of his, but he doesn't have 3 separate personalities, just the one. Since he also lacks hands, he has to use his heads to grab things, which can go badly sometimes. You'd think he'd cause a lot of damage to people or things around him, but actually Kiba is way worse than him. Kai is very gentle and kind. And always tries to be extremely careful, which is good because he's so big. It can be weird looking at how big he is, and knowing he's only 7 years old. It confuses me how a literally 40-foot Hydra with no hands can do less damage when he tries to pick something up than Kiba. Otoko Midoriya. Otoko is 7 years old, and his body looks like it's made of some kind of weird moss. It's not actually moss though. Don't really know what it is. It's like some flesh-moss fusion thing. He's also tall. Like really tall. He's like twice Izuku's height. And he has this weird tentacle on his face? With big bug eyes? It makes him scarier, which goes into his quirk. Anything that feels fear burns at Otoko's touch. Or rather, if you feel a certain amount of fear and touch Otoko, you will suddenly catch fire. He wears a special cloak over his body so people don't touch him, although it can make him a bit scarier looking because it darkens his face. Otoko is pretty gentle and likes quiet. He most hangs out in the greenhouse, the library, and the art room, and occasionally the pool when there aren't too many people around. I can relate. Also notable, he can't set Sansan on fire, most likely because she is a liquid. Mu Midoriya. Okay, I've never actually seen Mu. He's like Fukunoko, he doesn't like to talk to people. But apparently he does like to be around people. Mu's quirk is complicated. Dad said it lets him slip into another state or reality where no one can see or touch him, but he can see other people, and he can go through objects. He's a ghost. He's basically a ghost. And he likes to go around while invisible, and just look at people, according to Dad. Oh, and an important thing, anything that goes into this other state of reality will start to fall apart pretty quickly. And even Mu will eventually start to fall apart, but that takes a lot longer. Yonda Midoriya. Yonda is the ultimate privacy destroyer. And she embraces that. She's a 9-year-old girl with curly pink hair. Her quirk replaces her ability to hear and speak with sound, with the ability to hear people's thoughts and speak in their minds. And no, she can't turn it off. Apparently it still works a lot like regular hearing and speaking. It has the same range, and if you cover her ears and keep her mouth from moving she can't hear or talk. Which is weird because her quirk goes through walls. Maybe her ears and mouth are kinda like antennas or something. Because if you just cover her mouth she can still talk using her quirk, you have to actually stop her mouth from moving at all to silence her. Same with her ears, you can't just put your hands over them to stop them, you have plugged them up to make them unable to hear. In terms of personality she has two sides to her. One side is absolutely evil and uses her quirk to manipulate people. Kiba has fallen prey to this multiple times, and let's just say Yonda has never really had to lift anything heavy because of it. Although evil is an exaggeration. It's mostly just minor stuff. She doesn't do this often, but if she wants something or someone to do something she will get them to do it. Although times when she does this are kinda rare. Most of the time she's pretty nice. Using her quirk to try and help people with their problems. Breaking up fights between Kiba and however Kiba pissed off that day. Kyosei Midoriya. Kyosei lives inside of me. Yes, you read that right. Kyosei is a living blob of black ooze that is about a year old. Kinda like Sansan but stickier and black. His quirk allows him to go inside people, and basically make it his home. This is called a bond, and it comes with upsides and downsides the person he's inside, called the host. The upside is that it gives the host super strength, speed, durability, etc. It also lets them use Kyosei's body as armor or weapons. Notably, it lets you make tentacles that can stretch about 30 feet. The downside is that he makes you insane by enhancing your emotions, and eventually kills you by eating all your insides. So for most people it's not really worth it. Except for me, whose emotions are mostly dead, and whose insides constantly regenerate. So I get all the plus sides and none of the negatives. Well, except for Kyosei's weakness, fire and really loud sounds, I still have to watch out for that. Personality-wise he's a baby. Literally, he's like a year old. All he really wants is to eat and for me to be active. Mind you, he can understand people, and he has intelligence, so one day he'll have more of a personality. Netsu Midoriya. Netsu is a 7-year-old boy who is constantly on fire. His quirk allows him to emit fire and shoot it out like Endeavor, while also making him immune to fire. He's extremely powerful, and one day he will get more powerful than Endeavor ever could be. The downside is that while he is immune to fire, his lungs are not immune to smoke or a lack of oxygen. Turns out fire is pretty bad for your breathing, so if he makes too much fire in a closed area, then he'll suffocate himself. Also, his quirk is incredibly hard to control. So it's almost impossible for him to go a day without setting something on fire, and it's pretty easy for him to lose control when he's attacking. He can also use his quirk to fly, although due to his difficulty controlling his quirk, he often crashes into things when he tries. Personality-wise, Netsu is a lot like an anime protagonist. Simple-minded, likes to fight and eat. Although apparently he has an interest in art, which I didn't see coming. Most powerful list update. 1. Sanson. Still really powerful and hard to hurt. 2. Yami. I really underestimated what Yami could do. The amount of negative energy he can get just by being in the city for a few hours is insane, and the types of grim he can create keep getting weirder and more powerful. He gets stronger every day. It's very possible he could be more powerful than Sanson, but I'm putting him lower because if you actually manage to get to him through all the grim, he can't really fight for himself. 3. Kai/Kiba/Netsu. It's hard to tell who is more powerful here. They all have advantages and disadvantages, but roughly speaking they're around the same power. 4. Me and Kyosei. Thanks to Kyosei I've gotten a lot stronger. Combined with my regeneration we're really hard to fight. Although my regeneration is still limited, and fire and loud sounds can mess us up. 5. Shiruku. She has a lot of the same powers I do now if you replace tentacles with webs, except I think she's still a bit stronger and faster than me. But I regenerate and she doesn't, so she goes one spot lower. 6K/Mu. It's really hard for me to place these two. Because they don't have any real fighting ability, but their quirks can be an instant win in a lot of situations. If either of them catch you by surprise, they win basically unless your quirk counters theirs somehow. But Mu might have a hard time pulling people into his realm, and if you can get close to K without looking at her you can beat her pretty easily. 7. Fukunoko. Her gas dissipates really quickly and is really short range. But if you do breathe it in you are beyond screwed. 8. Eri. She can kill you with a touch. But she has to get close to you. She can also heal people, eventually. She still has to work on that. 9. Otoko. Same as Eri, but Eri's touch will instantly and definitely kill you no matter what. But Otoko first has to make you feel afraid of him, and even then if he touches you just get set on fire which will probably kill you but it might not. Also he can't heal people. 10. Yonda. Not really a combat quirk, but she could probably use it to see what an opponent's strategy is. Not much, but it's something. 11. Kyoku. Again, not really a combat quirk. Can't really use it too well in a fight. Tragic backstory list. 1. Eri. 2. Sanson. 3. K. 4. Fukunoko. 5. Me/Kiba/Yami. Tai. 6. Kyoku. 7. Dad. 8. Yonda. 9. Shiroku/Kai/Otoko. 10. Kyosei. He did accidentally drive his mom crazy and kill her, but he really didn't understand what was happening, and still doesn't. He is a baby so we'll have to see how that affects him in the future. 11. Mu. I don't know what his backstory is. Chapter 50, Fall. Chapter text. Money problems. It was early in the morning and Izuku was at his desk, doing paperwork. Izuku liked to get up very early, so he could get stuff done before he had to make breakfast. The paperwork he was dealing with now was actually not something directly related to the children, or the damages they cause. This particular mountain of paperwork he was doing was securing income. Now one would think Izuku being a humble, selfless person who was also extremely rich, money would be the last thing on his mind. However, Izuku had come to realize that most of his money came from the government. He'd used up most of the thanks for taking down the Yakuza money by now, and his mother and the government were the only sources of income he had. And both of those weren't necessarily reliable. His mother's company was doing okay, but that could take a turn for the worst at some point. And the government was known for screwing people out of money. And while he was confident they couldn't do that to him, seeing that their contract said that as long as he was taking care of any OPC they were to give him money, he'd heard tales of people more confident than him who'd had the rug pulled under them, and were left with nothing. Now compare that to the amount of money he would need to spend to keep this operation going, were the government to stop supporting him. The cost of food, the cost of maintaining the massive house they live in, the cost of repairing the massive house they live in, the cost of fixing up the land around the house whenever it got too badly damaged. The cost of paying employees and maintaining their benefits, when he eventually got some. And the absolutely enormous cost that came with maintaining all the kids' special needs like Kiba's blood, Kei's visors, Sanson's chemicals, Netsu's fireproof clothes, and items, Fukanoko's special room, the antidotes to Fukanoko's gas, Kai's everything. And those costs only increased with each kid he took in. But that was just the cost of the essentials. Izuku wanted to give these kids the best life he could, which included buying lots of video games, regular games, and sports equipment, and training equipment. On top of paying for all the stuff that came with each child's personal interests like Kiba's streaming equipment and Shiroku's dressmaking equipment. In summary, Izuku needs to be rich at all times for this to work. So the more income, the better Izuku felt. Of course, there was Eri's blood. While that money was also from the government, Izuku was much more confident that the government would continue. Why? Because it saved them a crap ton of cash. As mentioned, the cost of taking care of an OPC was a lot, and level 2 OPCs even more so. Meaning unless Izuku ramped up the price for Eri's blood by 300%, they'd be saving so much money. Then there was the more conventional way rich people got richer. Investing. This, as expected, got Izuku a lot of money. And then there were the more specialized means that involved his children. Shiroku often had a lot of leftover webbing and rejected or unfinished clothes made out of those webs, which the Spider Girl considered to be trash. Most of the world did not share that opinion, as ever since people started getting quirks that allowed them to make webbing, clothes made out of those webs had become luxury items, which sold for very high prices. This combined with the overall rarity of the material, made it so selling large amounts of quirk-produced webbing would make someone a very generous amount of cash. Of course, Izuku asked her permission before doing this, but as one would expect, Shiroku didn't have a problem with her dad selling her trash. Fu's remains were also something he sold sometimes. Something he found about Fu was that the boy could not eat his own body parts. His body would literally reject them and throw them back up. So whenever someone would dismember, tear apart, behead, or any of the various things that could be done to the boy that would result in his body parts being thrown around, Izuku was often left with just pieces of human flesh and gallons of blood. He saved the blood for Kiba, and he would sometimes save the flesh for Shiroku, but occasionally he was left with so much of it that he would just sell it online, or it would then go to people with flesh-eating quirks. All these methods required, of course, a lot of paperwork. Which is what he was doing now. Izuku laid his head on the desk for a moment and closed his eyes. He didn't need sleep, he told himself, his body wasn't screaming at him to get the hell back in bed, he told himself. He was fine, he told himself. He opened his eyes and looked at the clock and sighed. In 5 minutes he had to make food. Meaning he would have to finish up the paperwork. Izuku took a deep breath and quickly got back to work. Today would be a busy day. He would need a lot of coffee. Morning lessons. Alright everyone, please hand in your homework, Izuku told them from behind his teacher's desk. In front of him were Eri, Kei, Kiba, Fu, Kyoko, Shiroku, Yami, Otoko, Yanda, Netsu, and Ken, all in desks in front of him. After feeding everyone in the house, it was time for class. Some of the kids were more ecstatic about this than others, and by that, he meant Kiba and Ken really didn't want to be here. Speaking of people not being here, Izuku had decided that Fuku, Kai, Mu, and Nara didn't need to attend. Fuku wasn't here for obvious reasons. She most likely wouldn't be able to stay conscious in a room with this many people, let alone learn anything. He would have to give her private lessons later on. Kai also wasn't here for obvious reasons, Izuku would again give him private lessons. Mu was pretty much the same case as Fuku. Lastly, Nara wasn't here simply because she didn't need to be. To put it simply, she was a level above all the other kids in terms of her studies, and she was still determined to study and learn even more on her own, so Izuku just left her to her own devices for now, much to her brother's displeasure. Speaking of Ken, he wasn't dumb. But it was clear that most of his intelligence was dedicated to figuring out ways to fight people, rather than any academic pursuits. This could be seen by the fact that everyone else had brought their homework to the front, except him and Kiba. Izuku sighed. Ken. Kiba. Why is it that your homework isn't here with everyone else's? Oh, I forgot. Ken obviously lied. Ha! To think you could be so empty-headed. Caretaker, I apologize for my homework's disappearance, but I have a perfectly reasonable explanation. Kiba cleared her throat. The Grim ate it. Yami raised an eyebrow. They're lying. Ken ignored it and Kiba forgot. Yonda told him. Both the call-out kids immediately turned towards Yonda and glared at her harshly. I kind of figured, but thank you, Yonda. Izuku pinched the bridge of his nose as he felt an intense headache coming on. You two, see me after class. The two looked very, very displeased, and were still glaring daggers at Yonda, who looked incredibly smug. Alright, today we'll be learning about biology, Izuku told them, and he pressed a button on a remote, and the blackboard flipped around, becoming a large screen. And to do so, we'll be watching a show called Cells at Work. Izuku tried his best to make sure his lessons were fun. And he put a lot of work into his lesson plans. Because after all, how could he expect the kids to put in the effort if he didn't? 4 hours later. Class was now done. Of course, his classes were drastically shorter than most school days, due to him cutting out all the unnecessary fluff that schools were forced to teach kids for no good reason. It also helped that they all lived in the same house, so if anyone had any questions, they could come to him. However, while most of the kids left, 2 remained. Kiba and Ken, looking mighty unhappy. Let's start with Kiba. Izuku decided that going one at a time would be better. More precise and allowed him to focus more on certain things. Kiba, I know you don't forget to do these on purpose. But I also know the reason you keep forgetting is because you don't think it's important. Well, it isn't. Kiba pouted and crossed her arms. Yeah, if we're gonna be heroes then we won't need to do any of this stupid math stuff. Ken argued. You two do realize that to get into any hero school you have to pass a written exam, right? Izuku pointed out. Both their eyes widened, and it looked like he just told them they had a terminal disease. What? They both shouted. Yeah. It's a test with a variety of subjects from math to science to history. Izuku explained. And no matter how powerful your quirk is or how well you do on the practical exam, if you don't pass the written exam, then you don't get in. That's so lame. Ken shouted out in protest. Why does it matter if we're good at math and science and all that if we're strong? That is illogical. Kiba objected. Are you sure about that? Izuku asked them. Kiba, did you know that if you hit the air hard enough and fast enough, you can shoot out a blast of air? Or you can kick the air below you to propel yourself, meaning you could basically fly? Kiba's eyes went wide once more, this time with wonder rather than horror. Really? Izuku nodded, that's right. All Might does it all the time, and you want to know how we figured that out? By learning physics and science. If you want to be number one, then you have to not only learn how to control your quirk but learn about how it interacts with the world around you. And that means learning things like math and science. He then turned to Ken. And you should be especially motivated to learn about math, because your quirk has a time limit. PSH, what does that matter? I'll just take down all the villains before my time runs out. Ken said arrogantly. Ken, we both know that that's not always possible. Izuku sighed and took a moment to think of something. Alright then Ken, if you can answer this hero problem, then I'll excuse you from classes. Ken peeked up, wait really? Izuku nodded. Alright. Bring it on, Ken challenged, confident in his ability to take on anything hero-related. Alright, villains are attacking a park in the city. And the only heroes there are you and a hero with reconnaissance. That means gathering information, quirk, who can't fight very well, and you are in your feedback form. The reconnaissance hero tells you that there are 18 villains, with 8 hostages. The villains are in 8 groups of 2. 7 groups have a hostage and the final group has the group's leader. The groups are spread around the park around 10 blocks away from each other, and it would take you about 10 seconds to defeat each villain. You have 10 minutes left in your transformation. What do you do? A. Charge in and try to fight all the villains and save all the hostages. Or B. Wait around the park's exit so the villains don't escape, so backup can arrive and take down the villains? Izuku asked. Ken seemed to think about that for a moment, but after a few moments, he made an expression that told him what he was thinking. Why am I even thinking about this? The answer is obvious. And then he said exactly what Izuku thought he would say. The first one. I just have to kick their ass as fast as I can. Ken answered. Wrong, Izuku said swiftly. Here is where math comes in. First, you take the total amount of area you have to cover. In that case, you would have to run 9 blocks. Then you also take in the amount of time you take to defeat all the villains. Then you take in feedback's maximum speed. Putting all that together into an equation, and you'll see that it would take you over 10 minutes to do all that. Meaning you'd transform back into your normal form before it was done, and the villains would almost certainly kill you. So the wiser option would be to make sure the villains don't escape, while backup arrives. Ken wanted to argue. Because just sitting around and making sure villains didn't move sounded so much lamer than charging in and taking down all the bad guys. But what Izuku said also made too much sense for him to logically refute. That is one of the many situations where math is important as a hero. And I drastically simplified it for you. It's unlikely you'd be able to know that many details, so you'd have to make multiple calculations for multiple scenarios, and adjust them accordingly on the fly. For example, if one of those villains happens to have a powerful endurance quirk and would take a while to beat, you have to estimate how long it would take you to beat him, if you could at all, how much time you have after, and determine if it's smarter to maneuver around the villain and save the hostage, and then move on to save more hostages. Izuku continued. A miscalculation, or worse not making a calculation, with a quirk like yours, can kill you. Ken once again didn't say a word, instead just choosing to pout in frustration. It was another case of, he couldn't refuse what Izuku was saying, but he didn't want to admit he was right. Listen, I'll admit. Schools teach you a lot of useless information that you'll never need to know. It was scary to Izuku just how much time schools wasted teaching people things that no one needed to know unless that happened to get into a very specific field, rather than anything useful like how to deal with finances, first aid, or human rights and the laws of the country you live in. But I've done my best to trim away all the useless stuff you guys don't need while giving you everything you do need to learn and making sure you understand it. Which is what this homework is for. I can't go to all of you individually and make sure you understand what I'm telling you, so this is how I make sure. So I need you two to take this seriously. Both kids still looked unhappy, but in a different way. It was clear that they had gotten the message and understood things better now, but they just didn't like what they were hearing. If you two continue to ignore the few responsibilities I give you, then I will have no choice but to take away your streaming and gaming privileges. Izuku saw fear light up in their eyes after he said that, as it seemed they were finally gonna start getting their acts together. I'll be giving you this homework to do as makeup work, along with today's homework. Suddenly Izuku was interrupted by another coughing fit and pain in his chest. He quickly turned around and covered his mouth while leaning on the blackboard. Immediately the mood in the room changed, and Kiba and Ken both became a bit concerned. Caretaker. Are you ill? Kiba rushed over to his side, but Izuku held his hand out to stop her from getting too close and seeing the blood coming out of his mouth, and his pained expression. I'm fine. Izuku's words were broken up by coughs and pain, as he tried to catch his breath and not succumb to his weakening body and fall to his knees. Somehow he managed to pull himself together, and the fit subsided. Although a lot of chest pain still remained, he just powered through it. "All right. I'm gonna go take some cough medicine. You two do your homework." Izuku then left in a hurry, never turning towards them as he ran out of the room. The two children stood there for a bit, Ken not really sure what to make of that. "Hey Kiba. Is it just me, or is Izuku hiding something? Like, something bad?" Ken waited for a response, but Kiba didn't give him one, instead just standing there. Kiba? "I smelled blood," Kiba said. "Something is horribly wrong." Making calls. After spending a few hours cleaning up the blood coming out of his mouth, grading all the homework, tutoring the kids who missed out on class, and spending some time doing quirk training for Eri and Netsu, it was time for him to look at the order list. The order list was a list that was on a bulletin board in the hallways where the children's rooms were. It contained everything the kids wanted Izuku to buy for that week. There were a lot of requests weekly, most of which were pretty standard. Shiroku asked for more dressmaking supplies. Ken would ask for games, Kiba would ask for various items relating to her streaming hobby. But of course, sometimes they would request things that either Izuku couldn't or wouldn't buy. Netsu had somehow heard about Trigger and requested that, and that led to Izuku having to spend an entire class talking about why not to do drugs. Kei had requested a chicken coop so she could have unlimited eggs, and then Izuku had to explain to her why that wasn't an option. And Kyosei would occasionally try to ask for chocolate, writing it on the board whenever Fu passed by and wasn't looking behind him. But really the bulk of the unreasonable request came from two kids. One of them was unsurprisingly Kiba, who requested things like a castle, wine, a weather control machine so she could make lightning strikes whenever she introduced herself, and a request to build a moat of blood around the house. She was still asking to the castle, to this day. The other one was surprisingly enough, Fuku, who despite her rich background, or maybe because of it, didn't seem to know how money worked and thought that you could buy anything. Most of her unreasonable requests weren't for physical objects, although she did at one point ask for a rocket ship so she could isolate herself in space, but were for things like happiness, courage, and determination. And so Izuku took the paper off the board and started reading it over. Alright, looks mostly reasonable, aside from Kiba's usual castle request. Izuku walked over to his office and sat behind his desk, as he reached for his phone. It was time for him to order supplies. Not just the list of things the kids wanted, but all the other things the house needed. Firstly, he needed to take stock of their food, check how much they had, how much would expire and what they had to throw out, and what they could feed to Fu before they check on what they needed to order. Before he had to do all this checking and inspecting manually, taking stock of every bit of food himself, but now he could do it all from his desk, thanks to the seers. And when he ordered food, he didn't just order what they needed. He had to order a lot of surplus food. For two reasons: one, if something happened and the food got stolen or damaged or set on fire, then they wouldn't starve. Second, he always had to be ready in case Diyozi sent more children. He also had to take stock to see if there was enough protective equipment for the kids. Kei's visor, Netsu's fireproof clothes, gas masks, and things of that nature. And once that was done, he could finally make some calls to place orders for all of this stuff. And once that was done, he then moved on to house maintenance. Firstly, he'd have the seers go out all around the house, Kai's room, the storehouse, the greenhouse, and inspect them for damages. Once that was done, he filed everything into a comprehensive list. Then he called one of the construction companies he did business with, mostly the Urarakas, and asked them to fix it. Speaking of the Urarakas, being a small construction company from a small town that was adjusting to a new environment and new scale of construction altogether, they sometimes lacked supplies, meaning Izuku would have to purchase them himself, which meant more paperwork and phone calls. This embarrassed the Urarakas horribly, and they promised that after some reformatting of their company this wouldn't happen again. He felt horrible for making them do all that work, but on the bright side, after the shot in the arm, he gave them they were doing much better and were on the path to becoming a bigger, more successful company. Back to the topic of work, after all that was done, it was time for reforestation. Izuku once again sent out the seers, who were such a godsend, into the forest, to check the areas where the kids had been, for trees they damaged or destroyed. Then he would make a call to have all the damaged trees chopped down, the stumps to be pulled out, all the fallen trees to be taken away, and for everything to be replanted afterward. Then once that was done, he was finally finished with ordering supplies and maintenance. This all had to be done bi-weekly. Unless of course one of the kids did something that would cause him to do it sooner, which happened often, so really it felt like instead of it happening every 2 weeks, he felt like he did twice a week. He had to do it fast though, because after this he still had to do all the paperwork for the QR branch. Literally deciding the fates of some people's entire lives. So he had a lot still ahead of him. As he was looking over the last part of the list, he saw something that made him pause. A maid. Someone had requested a maid. And next to that request was the sentence, "You need help, Dad." Immediately Izuku's head fell onto the desk. He felt like a failure. It was very apparent that the kids were concerned about his health. Yami had taken it upon himself to spend his time making new grim to help him. Children should not spend their time worrying about the health of their parents. They should be free to play and do as they wish, learning about the wonders of the world around them until they grow up to be well-adjusted adults and live happy lives. If he couldn't let them do that, then what was he even doing? Suddenly, he started coughing again. Damn it, when I said I wanted to be like All Might, this is not what I meant. Izuku thought his blood flew out of his mouth. And then everything went wrong. Thud. Suddenly the little energy Izuku had seemed to leave his body, as he collapsed onto his desk. What? It became very hard to breathe as pain racked his body, and it felt like he was choking on his own blood. The last thing he thought before he fainted was, "I failed." And then everything went black for him. However, as it turns out, someone was listening to his thoughts at that moment. Outside the office, a few moments ago, Yanda walked up the steps to her father's office, determined to make him get some sleep. "I failed." She barely heard. She frowned before moving faster towards his office, stopping right outside the door. "Father. I'm coming in." No response. "Father?" Yanda was confused. It wasn't like he couldn't hear her. She was in range for her quirk to take effect, and she was literally speaking in his head. "Father, are you already sleeping?" No response. Yanda started to get worried. Something was wrong. She wasn't hearing anything. Which meant one of three things. 1. Either Izuku was in dreamless sleep, he wasn't here, or he was dead. And it was very unlike her father to sleep so early, well, early for him anyway, and he was normally here at this time. She might have been just being paranoid, but she wanted to make sure that was the case. So she opened the door. And was met with the sight of Izuku, limp on a desk that was dripping blood. Everyone in the house was woken up by a psychic scream ringing in their heads. That will be it for this part. I hope everyone enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like and comment if you want part 10. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe. I hope to see you all in the next one.